So, David Bruce Smith, I'm really, really glad to be with you here. I loved reading Abigail and John. It's a terrific book, but it really does make me wonder about children's books in general and what motivated you not only to do this great series, and this is the first, obviously, of a great series to come on presidential couples, but what made you interested in thinking about and then writing children's books? I know this is not your first, so I know you're going to be very thoughtful about this.
So there are actually two answers to the question. One is the series is projected to be about presidential and historical couples who had marriages that were partnerships. That's a very important point, and that's the reason why in this particular book, Abigail gets top billing. Usually, women did not get the credit that they deserved, but in this case, and it will also be true for the Madisons, had it not been for her, John would not have made it to the White House.
Now that is an extraordinary statement. So let's go back and talk more pointedly about this book. So talk to us a little bit about that marriage and focus on Abigail. What does she think of the marriage?
So the marriage was intimate. They were confidants. She was his only confidant. She was his advisor. And as a matter of fact, the coterie of men around him, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, whatever their relationship was with Adams, they knew that her advice was important to him. She was more politically savvy than he was. And remember, if you added up all the separations that they had during their marriage, Indeed. They were apart for 10 years.
Wow.
So she was left running the farm without slaves. The family, no one in the family had slaves because they didn't believe in it. So she had to tend to the children, tend to the farm, tend to the produce, tend to the livestock, get those children vaccinated against smallpox and hope they didn't die from it. And in the process, she made bullets for the Americans during the Revolutionary War, and she invested in government bonds with Hamilton, and later, because of that, made the family wealthy. So she had a lot of freedom in a way. That's not a decision that most women made, but she had to do what she had to do. And I'm sure he wouldn't have objected anyway. But they were very smart about their approach to marriage. Most people, even today, would say, well, overlook the negative. But they chose to accentuate the positive, period.
That's great. It's hard to look back so far in history and not sort of apply the lens of contemporary times. But maybe you could talk a little bit about whether Abigail and John's marriage was unique, whether Abigail had more freedom. I mean, you've touched on that already, but maybe you can expand a bit, had more freedom within that marriage, and whether that was simply because John was away so much or because that was the nature of the relationship, and whether that was fairly unique for their time period.
I think it was probably unique, but the way in which she used her freedom had more latitude, because if you don't have slaves, whether or not the husband is there's a male framework. They had no slaves, so she had to improvise. So it's hard to know how usual or unusual she was. The difference is, I guess the only way you get to really know them is by reading their letters. So there are 1,000 letters. Her letters are considered one of the best records of pre and post revolutionary America. The interesting thing was, the custom was to burn letters.
Yeah,
The Marshalls
well,
did it, the Washingtons did it.
Washington's, right.
They must have hoped for some kind of legacy, but their legacies were delayed. I mean, nobody really knew who John and Abigail Adams were until that miniseries, The Adams Chronicles, appeared in the 70s. And then it's kind of ramped up since then. David McCullough rescued him from obscurity. I mean, there's not even a John Adams statue and memorial, which is indeed kind of
right.
odd. And I think that, so think of, you have Washington, you have Jefferson. They are, very charming men. Adams was sort of a grump. He was difficult. He was stubborn. And I think one of the reasons why he didn't have a place in history is because he had no charisma. Charisma makes potentially for a place in history. His charisma, the best thing that he really did for this country, it wasn't the Judicial Act of 1801. That was the second great thing. The first great thing was giving the country Abigail.
That is terrific. I can see our Center for Women's History here at New York Historical borrowing that, or maybe stealing it if you give us permission. That's fabulous. Let's just go back for a minute before we continue talking about Abigail. Let's just go back for a minute to the fact that this is a book written for young readers. And that makes it somewhat extraordinary, especially given what you've said about charisma, lack thereof, and giving the country Abigail. What strategies do you think are important to convey a story like that to young readers?
Okay, I think that kids need to realize that history is his story. So think of it as a gossip session. So there are many stories in this book. There's the story of the two of them, which in a way they were overly symbiotic because their children, their boys, suffered. Two of the boys were alcoholics, not Quincy, but the other two boys. There's the story of her running the farm alone, struggling to make it survive, trying to stay independent even though she had a large family. She had a large family with a father who was very tolerant about female education. That's why they fit so well. He was a member of the clergy, but he said to her, and he had a big library, "You can read all my books. I encourage you to read all my books, but when I'm having a meeting here, you cannot talk because you're a girl."
Wow.
But she absorbed all that, and when she met John, it wasn't love at first sight, actually, but when those feelings started to shift, he wanted a woman who was his intellectual equal. That was pretty unusual. I mean, it wasn't just about beauty. It was, because she wasn't really, but he wanted a mind. She wanted a mind, and I think they literally had a meeting of the minds.
Yeah, and I think all of that is, those are really great lessons also for young readers to really understand how a couple might connect. And I think back on books that I certainly read when I was a child, and you have a natural curiosity about what makes Coupledon work. And these characteristics that each of them had, their respect for intellect, I think, above all, really was, as you say, a perfect meeting of the minds.
I wanted kids to get, whether they understood it or not, a glimpse of what a marriage looks like inside. So, because of the illustrations that my mother did, there is kind of like a Harry Potter quality, because it's a book that can be read with equal pleasure by a little person, or by a parent to a little person, or by an adolescent. And because the illustrations they're impressionistic and they're whimsical and they're sort of mysterious, you can make your own story from the story.
I totally agree with that. The illustrations really have a wonderful charm to them, and I think that young readers will be drawn to looking at them and to really wondering, a kind of intellectual curiosity that you always want to inspire in young people. But the story itself is a fairly adult story. I mean, marriage is a serious topic, and this couple has such an outsized role in American history, despite the short shrift that John Adams may have been given for so long. But there is certainly a revived interest in Abigail Adams as kind of our first template for the liberated woman. Now that's, obviously a contemporary analysis of a woman who was long before that model could really be justifiably applied. But she was rather exceptional, and she can quite easily serve as a role model for women in the contemporary world. And maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the story that you tell in the book that speaks directly to Abigail as a role model for women, really for anyone, but specifically for women who have an ambition to independence.
Well, it's funny because she does a little of both. She is independent, but she's not stubborn about it. She grew up in a family that was very religious, and her philosophy was do the right thing, follow the rules, and then things start to heat up pre-revolution. Meanwhile, John is out in the field, as they say, writing to her, and she's against the war initially. But he's writing to her when he's not with her, and he's explaining to her what's going on. And gradually, her feelings start to change. And she says something like, we've gotten to the point, sadly, where our only weapon is the sword, or something like that. And once she goes along with his conviction that that the revolution is a necessary thing, that's it. And so she bends in that instance. When she says, remember the ladies, she wasn't messing around. I mean, here he was in Philadelphia. They were drafting the Declaration of Independence, and he accepted it. but he could not act on it because the Continental Congress couldn't act on slavery. If he tried to push in equal rights for women, I mean, the whole thing would have fallen apart. That would have been even more controversial to those men. So he told her, in effect, that, he couldn't act on it, but he would hope. Better minds would at some point. But to me, it proves that was a bold thing for her to say, that their relationship was equal. Because he didn't slough it off. I mean, he absorbed it. And I think probably it put in the air somewhere the future suffragette movement.
Yeah, well, it would not be that much after their era that we would have sort of the nascent movement towards women's suffrage. So I think that, your analysis makes total sense. And I like your honesty about that story. I mean, everybody who knows anything about Abigail Adams is able to sort of spout, remember the ladies. But in the book, you're very serious about the exchange of Abigail's advice and the inability of John Adams to act on that advice, and it comes across, I think, in a way that will be, in some ways, provocative to young people who know, they know the rest of the story, and so they may feel a kind of frustration that John was not able to immediately act on his wife's advice. On the other hand, I think the book gives a total impression that this was a moment in time different from our own. And that's important as well for young people to know and recognize that history is the past and it is distinct from their own era.
Well, I hope it's received that way, because basically what he was saying to her, my hands are tied. I mean, you're probably right, but we have this other issue, the independence issue, which is the bigger issue right now.
Right, and I think that's a lesson, that's a larger lesson. You mentioned slavery, and that also was an issue that obviously was among the most troubling of our nation's history, but also was not resolved at that time. It was a postponement, a deferment of problems that we today look back on and have difficulty understanding how a nation that recognized the importance of equality and freedom failed to recognize that equality and freedom for all. But it was a time and a place, and I think a good book of history, which this certainly is.
I think still slavery, Jim Crow, the Civil War, none of those are really resolved because they're still being written about quite a bit. The interesting thing that I discovered during the book prize this year was Andrew Johnson sort of nullified all the freedoms that Black people would have gotten with the Emancipation. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Andrew Johnson, 99 years later, the other Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, reversed it.
That is, that's a wonderful set of bookends, two Johnsons.
Yeah.
Many years between the two of them. So now you've mentioned the prize. And though Abigail and John is a separate project from the Grateful American Book Prize that you developed, founded, inaugurated, and have pursued. I think it would be really interesting for people listening to this podcast to learn more about a prize that you established using language from your father, understanding that young people need really, really good historical literature. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so my father always referred to himself as a grateful American. So that's a sentiment. I decided to name the Grateful American Foundation after that idea. So that's a noun. My son is a seal, to be, and that's the verb. So when I decided to do a book prize, I wanted it, if it was possible, I wanted it to be an award for in writing and storytelling for biography, nonfiction, historical fiction for 7th to 9th graders. To me, it was very important that it was 7th to 9th graders because 7th, 8th, and 9th are really bad years. And I really do believe that during times of despair, books can be akin to a paper psychiatrist. So that was the thinking. And then I had to get a prize coordinator and all that, check all this out. And I learned from him, John Grimaldi, that of the 85 book prizes in children's literature, I was the only one in that slot.
Wow.
Which I couldn't believe. I thought Pushcart or Newbery or something.
Yeah, extraordinary. Well, certainly the prize fills a very important niche, as does Abigail and John. So let's go back to the book for a few further moments. Do you think Abigail would be surprised that her legacy has taken hold as it has in the modern and contemporary worlds?
I think she'd be surprised that it took so long. Because remember, they left 1,000 letters. Now, if they had been separated for 5 of those 10 years, there would have been fewer letters, so you wouldn't know so much. But they were separated, they were married 54 years, so they're separated 20% of the marriage. And I mean, there's so much that is revealed on both ends. So I think she would wonder, like, why was this delayed? I mean...
Well, I think you've explained that by saying that John was not everybody's favorite president. You use the word charisma, which he certainly in all characterizations, including the letters, I would say, he certainly gives evidence that he was not charismatic. Just certainly history has ignored him for a very long time until David McCullough, as you say, rescued him.
And the wife, I think, follows the charisma of the husband. I mean, think of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln. I mean, she's got a different kind of charisma, but if he were flat, she wouldn't be so interesting. I think that, she'll probably have to take this out, but I think that Nancy Reagan is the non-neurotic version of Mary Lincoln.
Interesting. Yeah, no, Nancy Reagan is definitely interesting to look at, and I imagine
they pushed themselves through their husbands to get to make the White House.
That's right. And I think that I hope you're going to write a book on that presidential couple. Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting one. So I think it's foreseeable that Abigail would not have come into her own, given what you've said, until she was really recognized as an independent woman, recognized for being Abigail rather than for being John Adams' wife.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that is really something that's quite, I'm not going to say unique, because probably that's an overstatement, but it is something that's extraordinary, fairly extraordinary for early American wives, that they would emerge out of their very accomplished husbands who had agency, whereas their agency was very restricted, to emerge as really, I mean, I think of the couple. Abigail these days is the star, is really considered to be the star. Would you have liked to have had her as a wife? What do you think it would have been like?
I don't know about the wife, but I would like to have both of them as friends, because they're a study in rough and smooth.
Uh-huh.
I mean, she certainly has great qualities as a wife. I mean, she loved him. She's dedicated to him. She's devoted to him. I mean, who wouldn't want that? Yes, I would, probably. I mean, who wouldn't want that?
Right, right.
I think she had I think she was she was an engineer. She had to have been an engineer as far as the marriage to make it work.
Uh-huh.
I mean, she certainly understood him, and now they're presented in such a way that it's hard to imagine that they even fought. But I'm sure she had to not just accentuate the similarities, but I think she probably did have to overlook the odd behavior.
Indeed. So what's next?
Dolly and James.
Oh, perfect. Right up our alley. Yeah.
I mean, she's another one. She also, for different reasons, he would never have made it to the White House without her. James Pinckney from South Carolina, I think, said when he ran against Madison the second term, he said, I would have won had I not run against Mr. and Mrs. Madison.
Well, she was formidable as a first lady, really, as someone who, again, didn't have the kind of agency that a man during her era had, but exercised a lot of agency in ways that she could. So that's great news. I think a lot of excitement ahead with that book.
I just want to say one other thing. You always hear that kids don't like history, and I don't believe it, because when you think of the popularity of Ancestry.com or 23andMe, millions are involved in that. And to me, okay, it's your history, but it's a starting point. So I think it's a misnomer to say that.
Well, it should be a misnomer. I think that history is fascinating, but I think moreover, biography is really what young people, not simply young people, but young people above all, relate to the stories of others, of their forebears, of people who came before them. And I think the way in which you depict these two individuals through their marriage accompanied by the really wonderful illustrations, will invite young people into the story in a way that the more often than not, dry history books that they're exposed to in their classrooms do not. And, it's all the story that you tell. It's all about the story that you tell. And you're a great storyteller. I know that from previous occasions, but you are a great storyteller. And it's terrific that your natural ability to tell stories is committed to this series. It's really is great. It will be a great advantage for young people to be able to read about not only the men that they may have heard about in their history classes, but the women who stood side by side with them in cases like Abigail and John. So coming in 2020, we will have copies of Abigail and John in our Barbara K. Lippman Children's History Library and in our NY History Store. And it will be on our Sunday story time reading schedule. So
that's great.
We will look forward to that. And we have a lot of young people who come for our Sunday Story Hour, and they will really, really enjoy listening to the story, which will be read by one of our great educators, actor-in-waiting educators. So it will be brought to life orally, and it will also be available for parents to purchase and bring home so their children can read it again and again and again. So it's, as always, a pleasure to see you here at New York Historical Society and to have the chance really to get some further insight into what motivated your writing of this series and what we have in store for us. We look forward to it. And
thank you, Louise, very much.
Thank you. And I look forward to our next conversation about your second presidential couple. Thank you.
Thank you.